Hey, what's up, guys? Let's go into one of our last topics within Unit 6. We're going to 6.9, the New South. As we go through this, keep in mind you're looking at this not only for content, but also as possible writing prompts. So pay attention to kind of how this is laid out, the questions that come along with it, and everything else. And we'll get through this as quickly as possible. So, as we start, learn Objective 1. Here's what we need to do, and this is what this whole topic is going to boil down to. As you can see, your overall guiding question for this topic is going to be explain how various factors contribute to continuity and change in the New South from 1877 to 1898. This is what we're focusing in on. Okay, what changes and what stays the same after the Civil War and Reconstruction? So you got to call back a little bit, or you're going to have to call back a little bit to before the war, the lead up to the war, and then during Reconstruction. Like, how do things stay the same? How do they change? And what are these things as we go? So, looking at the answers to it, remember the left side of the framework is always the answers. A, despite the industrialization of some segments of the Southern economy, agriculture based on sharecropping and tenant farming continued to be the primary economic activity in the South. So, here's your answer. Okay, the big change that's going to happen with the Southern economy during this time period after the Civil War and Reconstruction is industrialization, and then we have a couple of continuities coming from Reconstruction with sharecropping and tenant farming. So this is kind of your setup for what you're going to do. Obviously, you've got to be able to explain segments or elements of industrialization. You're going to have to explain sharecropping. You're going to have to explain tenant farming, and then identify how they are continuities or changes from the previous time period. So before we get into that, though, I need you to put this on the framework first, just a little context to get us to the point. Remember, a lot of these things we're going to trace the path till we get to the topic. And really, the context for this is really the coinage of the term "the New South," and it's going to come from a guy named Henry Grady, who was an editor, a journalist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in Atlanta, who had a vision, who had an idea of what the South could become economically after Reconstruction. And he coined it the New South, where he said the South was going to attempt, or they were going to have, a diversified economy. That's going to be different than the predominantly agricultural one that was before. So they're going to bring in elements of industry. There's not going to be a lot of government regulation and oversight, is what he's kind of pushing for here. That's where the laissez faire aspect of it comes, with the government being hands off, and then trying to open up the economy a little bit and not be so dependent on one crop as they were before. So that's the lead in, the context where the phrase New South comes from. Now we get into the actual components of it, with the big change that's going to happen, which is going to be the introduction of comparatively to the Civil War, a pretty good amount of industrialization. We've got three examples here of places who do experience this industrialization. Birmingham with steel production, Memphis with the lumber industry, and Richmond with tobacco. If you look at the picture on the right, that is a picture you could see at some point. This is the Sloss Furnace factory in Birmingham that came about during this time period, and still around today. It's a historical site. It's not a steel mill anymore. It's used for heavy metal concerts, ghost hunting, and stuff like that. But it is still there, and it's kind of a reminder of the legacy of the early industrialization in Birmingham. Along with these things, we're going to have some cotton textile mills that are going to start to crop up in the South. They're actually going to pass the North in textile production during this time period because it's close to the source, to the resource. The South is also going to become a part of the national rail network, and kind of be integrated into the national economy in the way that they weren't before. Now, there are going to be some challenges with this as it goes, and the main one is going to be the South is not necessarily going to reap the benefits of this, granted, small amount of industrialization, but industrialization nonetheless that's happening. A bunch of the stuff, these factories are going to be built with Northern money. The infrastructure is going to be put in with Northern financing. So when profits do come in from any of these industries, it's typically going to go back to Northern banks. So while there is industrialization, you do have to recognize that they're not seeing full industrialization because the money is not being circulated back into the South. So that is the big change as it goes. As far as the continuity with agriculture, sharecropping, and tenant farming, already been alluded to, so I'm not going to do it here, but do recognize them as things that carry over from the previous time period. All right. As we get to B, the Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans made during Reconstruction. All right, so when it comes to the change and continuity aspect of it, you can kind of go at this one either way. The big continuity is going to be that racial segregation is obviously still happening in the South during this time period. Um, and is going to be, as it says, upheld by Plessy versus Ferguson, that we'll get to in a second. But also, you could kind of address this as a change in the fact that some of the political gains that we talked about in Unit 5, with African Americans being elected to local elections, some in the House of Representatives, and seeing some positive gains within the political process, are pretty much going to be erased by this. But the main house topic of this um, is going to be Plessy versus Ferguson. So to go through that, for the context of Plessy versus Ferguson, put this into the framework first. Um, During the time period after Reconstruction, you have a group of Southern Democrats called Redeemers who come to power, and as they come to power, they discover they can keep their power and keep getting political power by playing on the racial fears of whites, from the fears we talked about it before Christmas, the social fears, the fear of loss of political power, of social standing, of economic power, of everything else. All of these things that are playing into the minds of white Southerners, these Redeemer Democrats are going to prey on that. To that end, um, they're going to attempt to begin to segregate public facilities by race. In other words, public facilities, one set for whites, one for blacks. Um, these are going to go into, it's going to tie into the civil rights cases of 1883, and where basically these cases, the Supreme Court is going to rule that if it's not discrimination by the government, it's pretty much legal when it comes down to it. So they said Congress could not ban discrimination by individuals or businesses. What that's going to lead into is a lot of businesses and a lot of places in the South begin this legal at the time segregation between blacks and whites. And one of the places where this is happening is going to be in the railroad industry with passenger cars. This all gets kicking off in 1892 when Louisiana passes a separate car act, which legally segregates passenger rail cars. So you've got rail cars strictly for whites and strictly for blacks. Um, a civil rights group in Louisiana decides that they want to challenge this law and check the legality of it. So, a guy named Homer Plessy, who, as opposed to what this picture looks like on the right, um, through his lineage and through his ancestry, um, could legally pass, or for visually, he could pass as white, although he was considered legally black in Louisiana, is going to attempt to ride in the whites only car of a railroad. When he does that, um, due to the Separate Car Act, he's going to be thrown off the train. He's going to be arrested. As that happens, the civil rights group who has kind of set this up sues the rail cars. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court rules that the 14th Amendment does not apply to this case. There's a clause in the 14th Amendment called equal protection, where everyone has equal protection under the law. The civil rights group is saying that the civil rights cases and the Separate Car Act violate violate the equal protection clause under the 14th Amendment. Supreme Court came out and said that separate but equal doesn't do it. So in fact, they make segregation in the South is basically reinforced again, is made further legal as it goes. So that's going to be the biggest thing with that. When it comes to the rest of it, for C, facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, African American reformers continue to fight political and social equality. We're not going to talk about the reformers here. We're going to do that in Unit 7 in progressivism, but you do need to recognize some of the things that are happening that are marking some changes with what happened since the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, some of the obstacles that African Americans are going to have to face during this time when it comes to being able to vote. They're going to be, in some cases, required to take literacy tests to prove their intelligence, their thinking, their literacy, however you want to word it. You have to pass. You oftentimes had to make a perfect score on these to be able to vote. They would also sometimes be required to pay poll taxes, which is what it says. You paid a tax to be able to vote. And also grandfather clauses, which said you could only vote if your grandfather voted in elections before Reconstruction. I think you can determine for yourself who did not get to vote before Reconstruction. So all of these are loopholes and obstacles. And, you know, deterrence to letting African Americans vote in the South at this time. You also have violence that will be referenced as we move forward with the continued organization of the Ku Klux Klan and the development of lynch mobs with organized violence, vigilante justice, if you will. Against African Americans simply for attempting to vote or simply attempting to live their lives and everything else. Like I said, I'm not going to go into those things here. We will do that later. But you are seeing things being thrown up to eliminate some of the gains that we talked about, some of the positives, the little bit that there were of African Americans during the Reconstruction era as it came to an end. So, with the reformers, the two names, go ahead and write them down. You got Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. We'll talk about them with progressivism and not only what they were fighting for in the South, but also how they differed with their visions for how to achieve equality and what equality meant during the really during the next time period. With all that, so get the stuff on the framework. Be responsible for it, and next time we will go into Unit 7.